Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's hearing on Eritrea and the root causes of the refugee crisis. I'd like to thank our esteemed witnesses for coming to testify today. You're each doing important, demanding work, and we appreciate your presence here. The global refugee crisis, for the most part, has been sparked by people fleeing countries embroiled in violent armed conflicts, but this is not the case for Eritrea. Though it has ongoing border disputes with its neighbors, Eritrea is not at war or experiencing large-scale terrorism. Yet, to date, in 2018, Eritrea ranks first among source countries of migrant crossing the central Mediterranean. Over 1,500 Eritreans have arrived in Italy in just the past 3 months. By some estimates, as much as 10% of Eritrea's population has fled the country since 2000. The rate of Eritreans crossing to Italy from Egypt and Libya was at an all-time high in 2015, when almost 39,000 people made the dangerous Mediterranean crossing. Of all the unaccompanied children arriving in Italy, Eritreans are the largest nationality. For those that leave Eritrea, the dangers they face are almost unimaginable. Many of these asylum seekers are exploited by smugglers and human traffickers or find themselves in Libyan slave markets enduring detention, torture, and forced labor. Some, after gaining their freedom, expressed they would rather endure the experience of slavery over again than to be sent back to their native country. In the absence of armed conflict, why are so many people leaving this country? As you will hear from our witnesses today, most of these migrants are in search of something far more fundamental than economic prosperity. They're trying to secure basic human rights and safety for themselves and their families. President Isaias Afwerki, has ruled Eritrea since 1993, and the country has not held elections since that time. Civil society groups, religious communities, independent journalists, and opposition political parties are marginalized and many times are criminalized, imprisoned, and tortured. Military conscription is mandatory and indefinite, beginning at the age of 18. In 2016, the UN Commission of Inquiry stated that the manner in which Eritreans were treated in detention facilities and military training camps amounted to crimes against humanity. The Eritrean government interferes and controls the internal affairs of registered religious groups and bans the activities of unregistered religious groups. Perhaps no group has been more harshly treated than Jehovah's Witnesses. Eritrean Jehovah's Witnesses were stripped of their citizenship in 1994, meaning they are denied permission to engage in most occupations and all higher-level education. They regularly face imprisonment for taking part in religious activities, and Human Rights Watch reports that more than 50 Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned in 2017. The Jehovah's Witnesses report that 4 of their members have died in custody in the last 20 years, and that they have no way to start a dialogue about their treatment with the Eritrean government, as the government has refused to meet with any representatives of the group from which Eritrea or overseas, within Eritrea or overseas. In 2006, the leaders of Eritrea's Coptic Orthodox Church, Patriarch Unbune Antonios, took a stand against state interference in religious activities. Motivated by his faith, his actions landed him in prison, and he has only been seen once in the last 12 years. On the wall of my office, I'm placing pictures of human rights defenders unjustly imprisoned for exercising their freedom of expression, and Patriarch Antonios is included in that group. Now in his 90s, he's also listed as in the Lantos Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. The purpose of today's hearing is not to condemn the Eritrean government, but to understand the human rights conditions causing the people of Eritrea to flee in such large numbers, particularly as it affects journalists, religious groups, and those forcibly conscripted into the military. Witnesses will also talk about the life-threatening dangers that these asylum seekers face on their journey, including human trafficking and forced labor. I look forward to the hearing today, and look forward to hearing policy recommendations for how Congress and the international community can more strategically address these complex issues. We're going to have 2 panels this afternoon. First, grateful to have Jana Mason, a senior advisor for external relations and government affairs in the Washington, D.C. office for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. She represents the agency's interest with the U.S. government, particularly the State Department, Congress, with non-governmental organizations. Grateful that you're here today, and with that, we'll give it over to you for your testimony.
Thank you, okay, let me start again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the Commission in general, all the members, all the staff, for the work that you do, not only on this issue, but on behalf of humanitarian crises and refugees around the world. As noted, my name is Jana Mason. I'm with the DC office of the, technically called the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's a big name. We tend to refer to ourselves as the UN Refugee Agency, which is a bit more descriptive. I've been in my position for 10 years, and in that time, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the work of the Commission in highlighting not only human rights, but refugee-specific issues around the globe. So I thank you for that and for this opportunity. As you're aware, refugees are persons who are defined under international law and under U.S. law as well as persons who are outside their home country, so they've crossed an international border, and they can't go home because they fear persecution. That's the key word. And that persecution can be on behalf of one of 5 things: their race, their religion, their national origin, their political opinion, political views, or their membership in a particular social group. And all those categories are very relevant, as you've said, to the situation of Eritreans. In my written testimony, I go into some detail about the situation of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers in neighboring countries and elsewhere. So today, in the brief oral statement, I'd like to focus on just a few key points and key messages regarding the challenges faced by these refugees and the response of my organization and our partners. First, I'd like to emphasize that the situation in Eritrea is one of the most underreported crises in the world today. I think that's very important to make that point. In January, the international aid group CARE, which is one of our partners in many parts of the world, launched a report called Suffering in Silence. And this report highlights what they call the 10 most underreported humanitarian crises of 2017. It sounds like one of those Facebook, lists of 10 things, but this one I would really commend to you. Because in this report, Eritrea is ranked at number 2. And they went in order. Number 2 of the second most underreported crises in the world. So to quote very briefly from that report, the prolonged military service obligation and forced labor, coupled with ongoing conflict, you mentioned the border dispute, and poor economic conditions, continue to fuel migration of young Eritreans. Eritreans constitute one of the largest groups of refugees in Europe and Africa, end quote. These facts in that report are bared out in a report that my organization did last year. Every year we issue our Global Trends report, and the most recent report from last year, in fact, shows Eritreans to be the 9th largest refugee group in the world. I think that would probably surprise a lot of people. And yet my colleagues and I here in the Washington office of UNHCR can bear witness to the fact that we're rarely asked to provide a briefing on Eritrea. We talk about Syria, we talk about the Rohingya, we talk about many critical crises around the world. Rarely do we get asked about Eritrea. So that's another reason that we really appreciate this opportunity today. My second point, after how hidden a crisis it is to give you a little more specificity on the numbers. My second point is to say that we're very, very concerned by our estimate of a current figure of about 500,000 Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers globally. As of last month, there were about 168,000 registered Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers in Ethiopia, one of the main neighboring countries. Most of the people in Ethiopia are in camps in the Shire region in the north and Afar in the northeast. Some 14,000 live outside camps, mostly in the capital of Addis. Another 115,000 Eritrean refugees were estimated to reside in Sudan as of the end of last year, and these are based on Sudanese government figures. Sudan, it should be mentioned, has hosted Eritrean refugees in its camps in the east and in Khartoum for more than 40 years, which makes this one of Africa's most protracted refugee situations. Again, not getting much attention because it's gone on for so long. Another estimated 140,000 Eritrean refugees resided in Europe as of the end of 2016, the most recent year we have those stats. In Europe, the major host countries are Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden. Last year, an additional 500 Eritrean refugees were resettled to Europe through formal third country resettlement programs, while about 1,100 resided or were resettled to the United States. The U.S. has continued over the years to resettle relatively small numbers of Eritrean refugees. Another 27,000 Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers are living in Israel. My written testimony goes into a little bit more detail about the situation in Israel. It's something that we've been very engaged on recently. Of course. Less certain, but of, oh, I feel like I'm Angelina Jolie. Less certain, but of tremendous concern, is the number of Eritrean refugees who have left the neighboring countries and undertake a treacherous journey via the Sinai or Libya to reach Europe. I know the Commission is very interested in this situation, which really leads to my third point, which is that refugees who undertake this onward journey experience numerous horrors and abuses along the way. Refugees fleeing Eritrea, just like refugees fleeing some other countries in the region, are exposed to extortion, kidnapping for ransom, imprisonment, torture, rape, trafficking, and even death at sea, crossing the Mediterranean. I know that some of the other witnesses will give more detail on that. But these individuals are extremely vulnerable and require urgent international protection. Of particular concern are the high numbers of unaccompanied and separated Eritrean refugee children who are extremely vulnerable to violence and exploitation. And I will say, despite the lack of widespread attention to this crisis that I mentioned before, there has been some very good, very compelling reporting done on the situation of people taking these migration routes through the Sinai into Israel, into Libya. And there's a very good video, there's some very good press reports. You probably have access to them. I could commend some of them to the Commission if needed. In fact, last night I rewatched a video that really tells the very emotional story of this journey. Which brings me to my fourth and second to last point, which is that UNHCR is stepping up our efforts to combat trafficking and smuggling of Eritrean refugees and others from other countries, refugees and asylum seekers. We undertake these efforts with a variety of partners, including governments and other UN agencies, including the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and UNICEF as well. These activities have included awareness campaigns aimed at refugees and asylum seekers, efforts to support the criminalization of smuggling and trafficking, capacity building for local border officials, and, when needed, offering direct support to victims of trafficking and smuggling. And I will say, when we talk about trafficking, smuggling, and what is generally referred to as a mixed migration, a mixed flow, it is important to emphasize the distinction between refugees and migrants. While both groups are clearly vulnerable in this context, migrants, especially economic migrants, are people who choose to move in order to improve their lives. Refugees are forced to flee to save their lives or preserve their freedom. It's not a choice. They often or sometimes take the same routes to a better life or to freedom. Obviously, we believe both groups should be treated with human dignity and with respect for their human rights, but as the UN Refugee Agency, our mandate is for the group fleeing persecution, and Eritreans clearly fall into that group. My final point is that Eritrean refugees, like all refugees globally, require long-term solutions. In the case of Eritrea, this would ideally take the form of a resolution to the domestic challenges that have led so many to leave the country in the first place, like the forced conscription and the forced labor that we talked about. If these issues were resolved, this could in turn allow for a large-scale voluntary return to Eritrea from Ethiopia and elsewhere that my agency would be happy to assist. That doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon, though. So while we're waiting for that, we really need to strengthen refugee protection and solutions, both in the neighboring host countries and along the transit routes. That's critical. So we and our partners are working to ensure that these vulnerable refugees receive appropriate legal status as well as the assistance that they need. However, the problem is that these life-saving protection efforts remain not only out of the public eye, but underreported and unfortunately underfunded by the international community. So we need greater attention, which just brings me back to my first point, which is that this hearing can go a long way towards renewing attention to this. We know the Commission often focuses on underrepresented, underreported crises. So we thank you for that, and hopefully this will be a step in regalvanizing some attention to this important crisis. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and to everyone, I apologize for the noise. Obviously, they're working on the doors, so we're not able to shut the doors. So there, I guess we can kind of shut them, but we'll speak loudly so people in back too can hear. But thank you again. Thank you for your work, and thank you for the information in your testimony. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more in detail. You touched on this in your testimony, but To what extent do you think the people of Eritrea understand the dangers they may face as they immigrate, if it's through Libya or Egypt or Sudan or Yemen or the Mediterranean? You talk about some significant dangers that they face there. Is there any way for them to be made aware of this before they feel like they're forced to leave?
Yeah, that's a good question, because as I mentioned, we are undertaking with partners awareness-raising campaigns to try to make them aware of the dangers that they could face. I think there may be two issues that explain why so many of them undertake this journey anyway. One of them is the experience that they've had in Eritrea, the fears of what they will experience if they get returned home, and the lack of opportunities in the host countries. Even though they're safe in the host countries, because of a lack of funding, for example, food rations in Ethiopia are about to be cut down from 2,100 calories a day to 1,200. I can't even live on 1,200 calories a day. When you have children who are growing and you have people that are already on the brink of malnutrition, this is very critical. They're losing hope. I mean, not unlike the Syrians, who in 2015 we started seeing large numbers of Syrians and others going across the eastern Mediterranean, even though they were ostensibly safe in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon. They were losing hope for themselves, for the future, for their kids. So when things are so bad at home and they see no resolution to their plight in the host country, they make the decision to flee. The second thing I think that might explain somewhat why they're willing to take these risks is just the youth. You know, we all know from this country, you know, young people often take chances that older people might not take because they're just not aware, don't have the experience to know what is likely to be ahead of them. And this is a situation that, although it's a refugee crisis, it's very much a children's refugee crisis, in part because of the national service that targets young people, and in part just because of other factors. There's probably a higher proportion of minors, and very young minors, in these situations than in other refugee situations. So they're young, they're willing to take a chance without being fully cognizant of what they could face, and they're desperate. So youth and desperation could be part of it. But nevertheless, we are trying to step up our efforts to try to, number one, explain what they could risk, and number two, maybe give them other opportunities.
Thanks. The EU, I know, has provided assistance to Sudan to counter human trafficking networks that facilitate Eritrean migration to Libya and ultimately to Europe. What impact has this effort had? And there have also been allegations that Sudan has forcibly repatriated Eritrean refugees to Eritrea. Are these allegations credible, and what happens to these refugees who are repatriated?
Yeah, although we do have a small office in Eritrea itself, we have about 14 people, we've worked there for many years. Our biggest role in Eritrea is to assist roughly 2,400 or so refugees and asylum seekers from other countries in Eritrea. So we do maintain a presence there for that purpose. We don't, however, have enough offices, nor do we have a mandate to do human rights monitoring necessarily. So maybe some of the other witnesses can talk to that. But we are aware of what we believe are probably credible reports of returns of Eritreans from other countries. We're usually not in a position, unfortunately, to stop these returns. And unless we can have access to the individual at the time, it's hard to know what category of person they fall under. If there's somebody that's already registered with us as a refugee, then we would, or as an asylum seeker, if we haven't decided their case yet, then we would intervene and probably put a stop to it. So others may have more information, but I would say that I do believe there definitely have been credible reports over the years, including recent years, of returns to Eritrea that probably would not be viewed as fully voluntary given the conditions that they're fleeing. In terms of the what role the assistance has had, I think any efforts to counter trafficking are useful, but I'm probably not in a position yet to talk specifically about Sudan and whether that's been very effective.
Okay. In your testimony, you talked about the increase in unaccompanied minors that are fleeing and making the journey out of the country, and oftentimes maybe as far away as Europe. I wonder what, from your perspective or from your work, what has attributed to the significant increase of unaccompanied minors?
Yeah, Again, I know you have human rights organizations testifying later. They can probably give more detail.
Okay.
But we are aware, for example, I didn't get a chance to mention in my oral testimony, but UNHCR has issued something that we call eligibility guidelines to assess the refugee claims of people from Eritrea. We do this for other populations as well, to give guidance to our staff if they're interviewing a refugee. And even though each case has to be considered on its own merits, we've identified certain profiles of Eritreans whose cases require a particularly careful examination of the facts and potential risks. And one of the categories that we recognized is women and children with specific profiles, as well as persons avoiding military national service. I mean, the military service has come up. You mentioned it, we've mentioned it, I'm sure other panelists will, as a major driver of people leaving. Obviously, many countries in the world have national service. I think it really bears looking deeply into this form of national service and comparing it with others. The reports that we hear are that this national service is prolonged, that salaries are not sufficient to provide for the needs of the individual as well as their families, that despite a minimum age, statutory minimum age for national service, that at times children much younger than that are forced into such service. So it's understandable that if parents want to avoid what they see as something that could be an abusive situation for their children, they will send them out of the country. Sometimes children, we have heard, are crossing the borders totally on their own, unaccompanied as well. So it's the age of national service, and it's the conditions as well. Again, people that are reporting on the ground from Eritrea can go into more detail, but we do believe that this is one reason that you have a lot of youth who have made this journey.
Thanks. Last couple questions, if that's all right. One, I'm not sure if you would have much comment on, and I'll ask the other panelists on this as well, but we heard from many people as we prepared for this hearing today on all different sides of this issue. There was some discussion, especially those who would be maybe more supportive of the current administration in Eritrea, of blaming much of this on Ethiopia and the battle there. Could you, from your perspective, what's happening there? What's the hope, I guess, for possible solution? And is that real as far as the impact it has on human rights? And then last question, I guess, would be any recommendations you would have to myself, to Co-Chairman McGovern, or my colleagues of what we can do here in Congress to better protect people who are in Eritrea. The hope, again, for them to be able to remain in their country and to be to have a safe place there. But if they are looking for a place of refuge, what else should we be doing or should we be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. On the first one, on the impact of, both the role of the new government and the impact of Ethiopia, that's definitely better addressed by some other panelists. I will say that, as I mentioned, we do work in Eritrea. We do have an open dialogue with the government, both in terms of trying to find solutions for those 2,400 refugees and asylum seekers from other countries in Eritrea. We're trying to get them either resettled in other countries, or in some cases, if they're more migrants than refugees, they want to return home, we're trying to help with voluntary return. We've had a very good constructive dialogue with the government in terms of the eligibility guidelines that I mentioned. Clearly they take exception to some of what we've written there. We rely on a variety of human rights sources when we come up with these guidelines, including some witnesses that will testify later, as well as the State Department's country reports, but we're always open to revising those guidelines. I think dialogue, whoever the government is, dialogue is always key. On your second question, I think the first thing you can do is what you're doing here, which is just raise attention, because you mentioned Eritrea, and they're like, what, where? So I just think keeping it on the forefront is good. There are a few recommendations. One would be, as I mentioned, for those, few 100,000 who are in Ethiopia and Sudan, most crises in Africa tend to be more underfunded than the ones, say, the Syria crisis, the Iraq response, ones that are viewed as more strategic interest to the U.S., or they're more in the news. our responses in Africa tend to be woefully underfunded. The U.S., of course, is one of the major funders for humanitarian assistance in general. We would encourage you to keep that up. And specifically with respect to WFP, the Food for Peace account is funding that. And as I said, we are at risk of severe malnutrition if WFP has to keep cutting food rations. Second, because there are so many children, unaccompanied children involved in this situation, even in the camps in Ethiopia and elsewhere, one recommendation that my colleagues on the ground gave to me is, as you're having bilateral discussions with the Ethiopians and others, giving them assistance in developing a foster care system and a better approach, because a lot of these kids are so incredibly young, but they're basically on their own in the camps, or they're being taken care of by brothers and sisters 1 or 2 years older than them. So a functioning foster care system, guidelines on how to implement that would be very effective. But finally, what's really needed, even though the ultimate solution is to make their journey safer, of course, the ultimate solution is, a better situation at home. But in the meantime, we really need more legal pathways, as we call them, for people to escape violence and try to find safety. Putting themselves in the hands of traffickers or smugglers is not the answer. But if there were more legal permanent resettlement, it doesn't always have to be permanent. If you have family reunion opportunities, for adults, short-term work visas, short-term humanitarian visas, ways that people can travel legally, even if it's only meant to be temporary, anything to prevent them from feeling they have no hope, but to put themselves in the hands of a smuggler and then try to take a boat across the Mediterranean. So more support for legal avenues for relocation would be very useful.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Mason. Appreciate your testimony and responding to questions as well. We'll transition into our second panel now, if that's all right. Oh, okay.
Good to see you again.
I know, it's good. Our second panel is Reverend Thomas J. Reese. Father Tom, thank you. We just worked together a couple hours ago, and it's good to see you again. Father Thomas Reese was appointed to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom on May 15, 2014, reappointed on May 12, 2016 by then President Obama for a 2-year term that goes through May 2018. Grateful again so much for your service and friendship and your work. And with that, I will turn it over to you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're very grateful to you for your dedication to religious freedom. And thank you again for participating in our program this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I am Father Thomas Reese and have served as a USCIRF commissioner since 2014. In my remarks, I will provide just a few points on religious freedom conditions in Eritrea that are more fully developed in my written testimony, and I request that my written testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Eritrea has long been one of the worst examples of state-sponsored suppression of freedom of religion or belief anywhere in the world. Since May 2004, USCIRF has recommended annually that the Secretary of State designated Eritrea as a country of particular concern, or CPC, for particularly severe violations of religious freedom. In September 2004, the State Department designated Eritrea a CPC, and it has remained on that list ever since. USCIRF's 2018 annual report will be released later this month, and in it we will once again document the systematic abuses the government has perpetuated in the past year. The Eritrean government does not trust or recognize religious communities which are relatively newer to the country. and only officially recognizes and allows activities of 4 religious groups: the Coptic Eritrean Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Sunni Islam, and the Evangelical Church of Eritrea. Any groups that are not formally registered, in essence, all but these official 4, are completely repressed. In the past year, Eritrean authorities conducted waves of door-to-door searches and arrests of individuals for their religious identity. In May 2017 alone, authorities arrested almost 100 Christians, including 49 evangelicals, at a secret wedding in the capital, Asmara. The government still persecutes Jehovah's Witnesses and denies them basic citizenship rights, including access to identity and travel documents. At least 3 Jehovah's Witnesses are Eritrea's longest-serving religious prisoners, having been imprisoned without trial since 1994. Although it is not possible to know the total number of individuals who have been detained, the State Department reports between 1,200 and 3,000 individuals are held on religious grounds. Activities of the officially registered groups, too, are heavily monitored and controlled. The government has appointed its own religious leaders for Muslims and Christians and arrested and imprisoned those who protest their decisions. One example is the forced change of leadership of the Eritrean Orthodox Church, the largest Christian denomination and one of the 4 officially permitted religions. Although he was elected as the 3rd patriarch of the church in 2004, Patriarch Antonius was arrested and deposed by the Eritrean government in 2006 for protesting the interference in the church affairs by the government. At 90 years old, he remains in detention at an undisclosed location and is denied due process. As part of USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience project, I have been advocating for the release of Patriarch Antonios and for his right to resume his leadership position. Last July, Patriarch Antonios was seen in public for the first time in 10 years, escorted by Eritrean security forces to a mass in Asmara, and then quickly returned to house arrest. It was evidence that he was still alive, which is an answer to the prayers of many of his followers. But let me use this opportunity once more to call on the Eritrean government to immediately release Patriarch Antonios and allow him to resume his religious duties without restriction. Freedom of religion or belief is inextricably linked with freedoms of association, assembly, and expression. The Eritrean government restricts all of these out of fear that they threaten the stability of the country. Yet, the surges we have witnessed in migration and asylum applications are a hallmark of unstable conditions. In this tightly centralized and securitized environment, obtaining credible information can be a significant challenge. Yet we know this, that thousands remain detained because of their religious identity. We know from reports of those who are released that the religious prisoners of conscience endure horrific conditions. They are denied medical care, kept in solitary confinement or in overpacked cells, subjected to extreme cold and heat. Every year, some do not survive these harsh conditions. Clearly, Many Eritreans are willing to risk poverty, enslavement, and even death in order to escape the appalling repression of President Isaias's government. Given these ongoing trends, it is our recommendation that the U.S. government strengthen its engagement on religious freedom issues in Eritrea. Specifically, the U.S. government must use all available channels to press the government of Eritrea to end the persecution of unregistered religious groups and to process their registration applications. We must also never cease in urging the government of Eritrea to release detainees held on account of their peaceful religious activities. As part of this, U.S. officials should constantly request to meet with Patriarch Antonios and other detained religious leaders at every available opportunity. Finally, the U.S. government should maintain the existing arms embargo and use the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act to sanction specific officials and agencies identified as responsible for religious freedom violations. We must not relent until we have helped to bring about a complete transformation in the human rights and religious freedom conditions within Eritrea. My thanks again to the Commission and you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and with that I conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Father Reese. If I can ask you a few questions, just following up on your testimony. I wondered if you could talk, and you touched on this, but with how central it is to the governing philosophy of the Eritrean government's hostility to religion, I wondered if that is really based on ideological grounds, or is it a result of fear or paranoia that marks the leadership's their view of any independent civil society groups? What's your position?
Yes, I think, the government claims to be a model of religious tolerance and harmony, but in fact we know it isn't. It completely disregards the experience of religious groups that have not been part of this official four groups that are allowed. I think that there clearly is a level of paranoia in the government. It does not like anything that rocks the boat, anything that looks like change. When President Isaias took power, he issued very strict laws governing religious affairs. And he has been enforcing these laws, and he believes that, that there's nothing new after the Bible and the Quran, and therefore any group that wants to come into Eritrea with new ideas should simply be kept out and blocked from spreading their faith or their views. And at the same time, he tries to use religious leaders for his own purposes, to support his regime. And this was one of the reasons Patriarch Antonios got in trouble, because he wouldn't excommunicate people who had gotten in trouble with the government. So this is a man who is imposing his own views on religion. He's trying to use religion to sustain his power position, and is not a respecter of religious freedom.
You mentioned in your testimony one of the groups that maybe has faced some of the most severe abuse are the Jehovah's Witnesses, who've been stripped of their Eritrean citizenship rights. I wonder if you could talk about what does that mean for the day-to-day lives. You talk about inability to travel for them. I wondered if they were singled out for that persecution, and again, how that impacts their day-to-day lives.
Oh, it really impacts them very seriously. And I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a classic example of a group that's being persecuted. I mean, the government will complain they're doing this for national security. This is a very peaceful group, and not a large group. It is absolutely no threat to the government. But the government doesn't like them because they do not want to be in the armed services. And of course, he's got this huge drafting system. These are people who are pacifists, who do not believe it's against their religion to participate in armed services. So In fact, they don't even vote in these circumstances. And so his response to that, well, if you're not going to do these things, then you're not going to be a citizen. And so they can't get ID papers. They can't get travel permission. And without ID papers, it's almost impossible to get a job or to do anything. Without travel papers, of course, it's impossible to travel. So they're treated as non-citizens, despite the fact that they've lived all their lives in Eritrea.
Could you talk a little bit about the Roman Catholic Church? It appears that they're still under government scrutiny. They have been afforded some special permissions. How was it that the Catholic Church was able to gain those concessions? And do you think there's any hope from that, maybe that other groups might be able to learn from and see?
Yeah, well, I think one of the strengths the Roman Catholic Church has is the fact that it's a large international institution. The Vatican is always looking out for the good of the local churches. They have an embassy called a nunciature in Eritrea. They have an ambassador, a nuncio there. And he argues very strongly to the government, to the president even, for the religious freedom of the Catholics there. So I think it's an advantage that they're part of a large international organization. They know that there are people all over the world who treat these Catholics in Eritrea as their brothers and sisters and are going to be watching and concerned about what they have. So I think what's the lesson for other groups? I think the lesson is that we need to work together. All of us, all Christians, need to work together, form alliances, form both local and international organizations that, so that we fight for one another and support one another's religious freedom.
Last question I have for you. You note or touched on the idea that it's possible that the Eritrean government surveils religious groups in the diaspora. Is there anything that the United States can do to prevent this activity? And I guess the last part of that would be any other recommendations you would have me bring to my colleagues of recommendations of what Congress ought to be doing, again, to protect all people's rights and freedoms there.
Yeah, this is very important. Eritrea uses a tax of 2% as a tool for controlling the diaspora members, and it uses intimidation and to force the payments of these things. Just earlier this year, the Netherlands actually expelled the highest diplomat of Eritrea from the Netherlands because of their activity in trying to force people to pay these taxes and using intimidating tactics towards the Eritrean diaspora. So I think it would be important for the United States government, Congress, and other agencies within the government to have good contact, good relationships with the Eritrean diaspora in the United States so that they know they have someone to go to who will protect them and defend them, these people who are being pressured on our own soil here in the United States. We have an obligation to defend them.
Father Reese, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and your work. And with that, we'll move to our third panel.
Thank you again for the opportunity and for your work.
Thank you. Our third panel is ready and grateful for you being here. First, it's a privilege to introduce Maria Burnett, who's the director for the East and Horn of Africa in the African Division of Human Rights Watch. She supervises the organization's work on East Africa with long-term expertise in Uganda, emerging human rights issues in Burundi, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Thank you so much for being here. I'll also introduce our second witness, Abraham Tesfalu Ziare, Executive Director of Penn Eritrea in Exile. And he is also pursuing his PhD in the School of Media Arts at Ohio University, and grateful that you're here to testify as well. So with that, I'll recognize Ms. Burnett, if I could first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this hearing today. I'm honored to be here with my colleague here from Eritrea. I want to start by saying that Eritrea remains among the most difficult countries that Human Rights Watch works on. It is a country where access to independent information is nearly impossible, and it is a country where we labor quite hard to verify the allegations that we receive and to do research in a way that leaves the people we speak with safe afterwards. We obviously do this in all countries, but where there's an extreme risk of reprisals, it's a serious concern. So there's a great deal about the human rights conditions in Eritrea that we wish we knew better, I want to start off by saying. As many have said this morning, this afternoon, thousands of Eritreans, particularly young people, flee every month. Based on our research over many years, it's very clear that Eritreans seek to escape what is known as national service. And as we mentioned, by the 1995 proclamation, Eritreans are subject to 18 months of national service, including 6 months of military training. And Eritrean law also requires anyone who leaves the country to hold an exit permit, which is issued only selectively. To be clear, the limited terms of national conscription are not actually in and of themselves a human rights violation, but the Eritrean government disregards the proclamation's time limits. Many conscripts are forced to serve indefinitely. Human Rights Watch has interviewed hundreds of Eritreans who ended up fleeing after serving more than a decade. In some cases, we have one case, for example, of someone who was there for more than 17 years in national service. And while some fortunate conscripts are assigned to civil service jobs or as teachers, many are placed in military units assigned to work on development projects in agriculture and in infrastructure, but none have a choice about their assignments, their locations, or the length of their service. Pay is below subsistence, although there's been some announcements that pay will be increased. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry in 2015 correctly calls Eritreans' national service a form of enslavement. And during national service, we have documented many instances in which commanders subject conscripts to physical abuse, including many instances of torture. In the past few years, as others have mentioned, more and more unaccompanied children have fled Eritrea. When we've carried out interviews in Europe, many of those children have explained that they feared being forced into possible indefinite military service. Many children told us that they had observed what had happened to their parents, to older siblings, and to other close relatives who had been forcibly conscripted, and they didn't want to suffer the same fate. An 18-year-old boy who we interviewed summed up what many have told us. He said, "We love our country, but when you finish grade 12, you become a soldier for life. You cannot feed your family. You're the property of the army, and I didn't want that for myself, and so I chose to flee." The abuses in national service are long-standing and well-documented, and recent interviews reveal that, sadly, nothing has changed in recent years. It's one of the things that make the human rights situation so difficult. It's difficult to get international attention to something that remains as intractable and as pervasive as national service is in Eritrea. Citizens in Eritrea cannot express their views about national service or other matters, to question government policies. There's no legislative representation. There's no independent press. There's no independent non-governmental organizations to which citizens can turn. And the government tightly controls the judiciary. In some instances that we've documented, Eritreans who criticize or question government policies have been punished without trial or without means to an appeal. And indefinite imprisonment is sometimes the punishment, sometimes accompanied by physical abuse. Imprisonment can be incommunicado, and relatives are often not told of the whereabouts of a prisoner, much less allowed to visit. In some instances, relatives of those who are speaking out have also been punished. They have been denied government ration cards, for example, ration cards which are needed to buy scarce but essential provisions. And unfortunately, as we heard earlier, abuses do not stop when people choose to flee Eritrea. Fleeing Eritreans are victimized along the smuggling routes, especially those trying to reach the Mediterranean. We have documented rampant abuses in Sudan, in Egypt, and in Libya, as well as those who have died in the crossing of the Mediterranean. Those who have survived that crossing have told our Human Rights Watch researchers of horrific stories of the dangers that they encountered during their journey. But many of them have insisted that the risks and the dangers and the abuse that they faced were worth it in comparison to the oppression that they faced in Eritrea. Another young man who we interviewed in Italy after a 3-month journey from Eritrea told us, "I fled my country because of all the problems I had while I was in the army. I don't want to be a soldier, and they beat me and tortured me when I was caught trying to escape. But when I finally got out, I thought I would be free, but I was beaten and tortured even worse when I was in Sudan and then Libya by the smugglers. Crossing the sea was terrifying for me, but I'm so relieved to finally be here." There are steps that the Eritrean government could take to stem migration, and importantly, that will mean addressing the human rights crisis that has racked the country. It could end indefinite national service and respect the 18-month time limit. It could begin the process of demobilizing conscripts. It could penalize military commanders and security officers who authorize torture and other forms of severe physical punishment. It could unconditionally release political prisoners and bring anyone it considers an offender before a truly independent court of law. It could stop the interference with all forms of peaceful religious expression, and it could allow for the establishment of an independent press and non-governmental organizations. And it could finally publicly affirm and enforce rights to free expression, opinion, religion, association, and movement. But unfortunately, the Eritrean government has steadfastly refused to change. And in the absence of a willingness by the government to end these abuses and bring abusers in government to justice, other countries should work to investigate and prosecute individuals suspected of committing serious crimes under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Countries concerned by human rights abuses of Eritreans and Eritreans' efforts at migrating should work to undercut the Eritrean government's public excuses for repression and protect Eritreans who have fled from being repatriated and suffer further abuse. It's important to note that the U.S. has played an important role in the region historically. The United States was a guarantor of the Armistice Agreement to end a 2-year border war, which also established the International Boundary Commission to demarcate the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 2002. And while both sides agreed to accept the findings of the International Commission as binding, Ethiopia later refused when the final decision was to award a key piece of territory to Eritrea. President Isaias uses the border issue of no peace and no war as his principal excuse for his repressive policies. And while both sides have firmly entrenched their positions, there may now be some consideration and an opening for reconsideration as Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, recently expressed his desire to resolve disputes with Eritrea after, in his own words, years of misunderstandings. And with a new U.S. Secretary of State confirmation underway, we could see some change at senior State Department levels. It's particularly important that we find that there is a new Assistant Secretary for Africa, that position is filled, that someone competent and capable is nominated to that position quickly. That will help perhaps to address some of the human rights challenges in the Horn and potentially in Eritrea particularly. And last September, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the State Department announced an intent to repatriate about 700 Eritrean individuals who are currently here in the United States. The United States and other countries should urgently take steps to protect the Eritreans who have managed to flee their government's oppression and take into consideration the pattern of serious human rights abuses in Eritrea when they're examining their asylum claims. It's critical for the U.S. to ensure that no one is returned to a threat of persecution or to torture in Eritrea. By shedding light on what's happening to Eritreans in Eritrea and in countries of potential asylum, this commission is performing a welcome and important public service, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Burnett. Appreciate that very much. Next, we'll recognize our final witness, Mr. Zaire.
Okay, they will have this one. Okay, this one.
Use them both.
Thank you, Congressman Wolfgren, Congressman McGovern, Commission members, and staff. I'm honored to be here today. In comparison to many Eritreans, I'm one of the most privileged. I'll tell you why. I have 9 siblings. All of us have served in the Eritrean military army. Because of this, 10 of us have never met together at any given time. The only family portrait we have now is photoshopped. 7 of the 10 members of the family are now in exile. I was writing for a private newspaper called Zaman while in my final year of secondary school in 2000. I joined the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, hoping that I have a bright future in the growing private media. After completing my freshman in year 2001 and returning from labor camp along with students of University of Asmara, all the private newspapers were banned. Their editors were taken to custody. For close to 17 years now, the fate of my mentor Aman al-Asrat and the other 11 journalists is unknown. Later, the only option I had was the state-owned newspaper. I had a weekly column, but later I resigned as my articles started to displease Information Minister then, Mr. Ali Abdu. Some years later, when I wrote an article in the party magazine, Ali Abdu responded in the state newspaper. He identified me as national security threat and called me for my arrest. Since then, I completely stopped writing in the country. 3 years later, Ali Abdu himself fled and sought political asylum in Australia. In the fall of 2011, I received a scholarship from Ohio University. As travel is controlled by the Office of the President, as Maria was explaining, I had to lobby and pull influential contacts for 4 months. Finally, a few days before my planned departure, I was denied exit visa. I went in person to the Office of the President to discuss my case with the director. In 2012, I was permitted to go to South Africa for a study. I was only able to reach this level because of my connection. I was very fortunate. Then, most of my friends were in prison in connection with Radio Bana raid. 29 journalists and staff members of the educational radio station were held in military prison from 4 to 6 years. As Sfagergi Sapte, who studied journalism with me, wrote later, they were forced to defecate in their dishes and later wash them for eating food. You don't need to commit any offense to be arrested in Eritrea. For example, one person stayed for 4 years in prison with Radio Bana journalists only because he was mistaken for another person with the same first name. Now I write for different media. Still, the Eritrean government attempts to silence me from far. In July 2017, when I wrote an article for Al Jazeera English, the Eritrean Minister of Information issued a statement calling me, quote, a notorious author who routinely engaged in a smear campaign against the country, unquote. I'm not sure who did it, but last month my blog was also attacked with malware. Those are on top of the endless trolling and hate messages I receive daily. And by now, I'm sure they are also trolling on Twitter. However, I'm also very much aware of the conditions of state journalists inside the country. As part of the Popular Army program, journalists have been required to attend military drills and guard government offices since 2012. Now, their performance has been measured by the military. If journalists commit slightest mistake, they are being disciplined not as journalists but as soldiers. As I said in the beginning, mine is just a privileged position. If I have little time, I can mention 2 typical examples to show how Eritreans are not afraid of death, but living in such deplorable conditions in Eritrea. My cousin, she's my first cousin, Mibra Anraya, was killed by human traffickers in Sinai in 2010. Although the ransom was paid, yet her life was not spared. Despite the family tragedy, Mibra''s youngest son, Samuel, has reached Europe last year through Libya. Or, as Shisha Shimendi, member of Pan Eritrea, tells, he decided to flee Eritrea a week after tragedy of Lampedusa of October 2013 that took the lives of more than 300 Eritreans. After completing his first degree in business administration, Shishai was assigned as a teacher. With a monthly pay of $25, he was expected to cover all expenses in a remote place from his hometown. With such conditions, he's managed to stay for 3 years. Yet, he was required to carry gun and attend military training on top of his teaching duties. Later, he decided to flee. After being caught and imprisoned for 3.5 months in Libya, he succeeded to escape from prison. Near the end of 2014, through Mediterranean Sea, he managed to reach Europe now. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. If it's all right, I can address some questions to each of you. Ms. Burnett, has increased involvement of European authorities with Eritrea resulted in any notable positive impacts or changes in Eritrea? And has Eritrea permitted access by international human rights monitors as a result of European or other diplomatic engagements? And if so, what are the focal areas of EU's multi-million-dollar assistance programs for Eritrea?
Yeah, thank you so much. As far as we know, it's pretty difficult to find the positive impacts associated with that increased engagement by the European Union, European authorities. As far as we know, no, there has been no increased access for independent human rights monitors from any institution, including the UN Commission of Inquiry and from the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea. So that would certainly be a key recommendation as well, for the U.S. and the European Union to work together to apply, joint pressure for access to independent monitors to the detention conditions that various witnesses today have spoken about. As far as we know, the EU assistance packages have focused on development, particularly on renewable energy and food security. Human Rights Watch doesn't work on those two topics in great depth, so I can't say a great deal about them. I will say that we have a lot of concerns about access to education, particularly in light of the forced military service and the fact that children are fleeing in such large numbers. I think we have a real lack of education crisis for a whole generation of young Eritreans, if not more than one generation of young Eritreans. But we haven't seen, and I am unaware of any explicit assistance from any international donor to the education sector, though it's hard to say, and things can be hidden in various budget and sector supports. EU budget assistance is a beast to parse. So yeah, in the interviews that we've conducted, development and a lack of development is not one of the issues that people raise. What people raise is national service and the repressive nature of national service. Clearly, development is important, but I think until the system of national service is dismantled, until the time limits are respected, I think there's no amount of development that will make people want to stay and live in enslavement.
Thanks. I'll kind of jump back and forth if that's all right. Mr. Zara, I'm struck by the fact that you consider yourself privileged in comparison to other Eritreans, yet you describe terrible tragedies experienced by your family members who fled Eritrea. Would you say most Eritreans have family members who've attempted to flee Eritrea? And to what extent do people in Eritrea understand the dangers they may face if they immigrate?
I think, okay. I'm sure most Eritreans are also very much aware of the conditions if they try to flee the country. But as I said in my testimony, they are not afraid of this now. They are afraid of living in the country. So they can take any chance to flee the country because they don't see any future. They can't work. They can't have a future. They can't establish a family. So even if they are very much aware of the conditions fleeing the country, they just decide to flee. Because they see if they flee the country, they might say, at least we can have our chance of being different than staying in here indefinitely.
Thank you. If I can address this to both of you, and I asked this earlier, but if Eritrea's relationship with Ethiopia were to improve with some of the changes there, would that have an impact on human rights conditions in Eritrea, in particular the indefinite nature of national service that we've talked about? What are the prospects for an improvement in relations under the new Ethiopian Prime Minister? And is there anything the United States could do to facilitate a thaw in Ethiopia-Eritrea relations? Could UAE play a helpful role given its security relationship with Eritrea?
I would say it might have positive outcome. And I would expect, for example, the US Congress also to put pressure on Ethiopia to demarcate the border. If that's demarcated, then Eritrean government will not have any excuse to subjugate its subjects, its citizens. then we can say, since it's using this excuse only as excuse for any abuses, then they do not have any excuse after that. So I would say they might have, and I hope so, to have.
Maybe I'll just add, I mean, I think one of our concerns in this long and ongoing problem between Eritrea and Ethiopia from the US side has been a lack of balance, right? I mean, what we would argue for as a human rights organization is engagement on the human rights abuses that are taking place in both countries. And what we've seen is obviously a great deal of engagement, particularly on the, military issues in Ethiopia between the United States. It's a prime partner in US work on the Horn of Africa, and then a very different scenario in Eritrea. There are a huge number of domestic abuses in Ethiopia as well that warrant a great deal of scrutiny. It's been a very tumultuous couple of years in Ethiopia with protesters being killed and a serious problems of free expression and free assembly. So any engagement, I think it's important, not just for the value of condemning human rights abuses, which obviously is something that we support, but it's important for both countries to see that the US is coming in, committed to human rights enforcement in both countries and that they care about the same issues in both countries. This is not choosing one over the other.
That's helpful. Thank you. Ms. Burnett, and you've already talked about this, but I guess, is there anything else that we could be doing? We talked about this relationship with Ethiopia and Eritrea, but also any other things that the United States could be doing to encourage greater respect for human rights in Eritrea more generally?
Yeah, we've mentioned some of them already. I mean, I do think it's really important that this issue of independent human rights monitors' access to Eritrea and to locations of detention remains a really primary issue. And I think it would be important to work through in collaboration with both EU colleagues and, frankly, African Union colleagues as well. There's no reason why these international bodies couldn't come together to work with Eritrea and to collaborate on this issue of independent access. There are countries that allow independent access, that allow ICRC, for example, and other independent UN mechanisms. I think it's important that Eritrea understand that this is an issue of concern across the board, and that it's no individual institution that's being singled out. I think that any issue around development assistance from the EU, I think it's critical that there be, some conditioning on progress on human rights norms. We've seen in a lot of countries that it can function best when the US and European countries work together and are speaking the kind of same language around human rights protections. And so I think it would be important to see that there is conditionality on progress for human rights on assistance if it goes forward. I think it's also really important that companies that are working in Eritrea don't rely on forced labor and conscripts for their work. There are a variety of companies, not many, but there are some working, and it's an area of concern. While we support Global Manginski as a tool generally and are keen to see it utilized, right now we don't feel we have enough research to name names, but it's something that we'd be willing to sort of stay in touch with going forward as our research unfolds. And obviously, you all have a lot of tools for access to information, so ensuring that all of those channels are open and are feeling as if they can come forward and share within the context of names under Manginski, I think would be important. Yeah, so I'll stop there, but I do think it is really critical that this issue of Eritrea remains on the front burner. I know, as we talked about, humanitarian problems in Africa can often get short sight, but Eritreans deserve our attention, and this issue deserves a good resolution.
I agree. Mr. Zera, have conditions for journalists in Eritrea improved at all since you left the country? And is there any reporting inside the country aside from the state-run media? Are all independent Eritrean journalists based outside of the country? How does information travel in and out of Eritrea?
Yeah, since I left the country, things have been getting much worse. In fact, as I said in my testimony, journalists are now armed and have to do military drills, and they have to go to guard government offices in the evening. So things are much getting worse from the time I left the country. So any information coming from the country is just, we'd have different informal channels through contacts in the country or through other channels, because the government never tries to clarify anything. If there's any issue, they just deny it automatically, and then it's difficult to get access to accurate information from inside. So we have different means of accessing information, and which also makes it difficult to access anything from the country.
Thank you. In the midst of the human rights conditions that you talk about getting worse in Eritrea, what message do you think the people of Eritrea need to hear from the international community?
They need to hear that they have support behind, because they feel they're being helpless and being thrown in the middle of nowhere. So I would say, for example, if US could help Eritrean refugees, say from Sudan, from Uganda, and for example, if US could also stop deporting 700 Eritreans who have been denied asylum from US, or if we could help Eritreans in Israel who are being waiting indefinitely for any action. So I would say it's now too late to engage the government, but if you could help the people who are widely dispersed in other countries, it would have been much helpful.
Thank you. Ms. Burnett, how successful has Eritrea been at collecting its 2% tax on earned income abroad?
Yeah, it's something we've tried to figure out, but to be honest, I don't think that we know. They clearly put quite a bit of effort into it, but it's not really clear how successful they've been at it. So yeah, I wish we knew more about it. It comes up obviously, but it's really difficult to monitor it consistently anywhere.
Yeah, I think so. Mr. Zara,
Yeah.
given the level of repression in Eritrean society, do people feel that fleeing the country is really the only option they have for countering human rights abuses of the government?
Sorry?
Given the level of repression there, is your sense that people are feeling their only hope really is to flee the country, that they really don't see a hope of things changing inside?
Yeah, that's the main reason that they're feeling, yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask one last question, if I could, to each of you. First, Ms. Burnett, to your knowledge, have any U.S. officials or family members of the former U.S. Embassy local staff detained in Eritrea been able to visit them or verify their welfare since they were detained?
We don't have very recent information on that, but as of the last couple of years, our understanding is no.
Okay. If you hear anything more, please let us know. And then, Mr. Zara, as you know, our commission has a Defending Freedom project that advocates for prisoners of conscience. Among them is Eritrean writer Dawit Isaak, who was among many journalists and writers arrested in September 2001. We still don't know if he's alive or has died in custody. I wonder if you have any update on his condition.
I'm just like you, I just have news from different sources, otherwise the government has never clarified the fates of him and other 11 journalists and political figures, so we just have been waiting for 16 years now.
To wrap up, any last suggestions you have for us? First, again, thank you. Thank you for coming and testifying. And I'd give both of you just one last chance of other suggestions as a kind of a last suggestion I should be sharing with Co-Chairman McGovern, but also my colleagues who are very concerned about the situation in Eritrea.
Thank you for conducting these kind of sessions. As I said before, and Maria also mentioned, I think as now we can at least do something against the deportation of these 700 Eritreans who have been denied their asylum case, because it's very unsafe to return them back home. We have seen this with Sudan. Like Sudan has imprisoned some Eritreans they round up them and then they sent back to Eritrea, and they were put in prison for immediately. So it's never safe to return refugees who have fled the country to return to the country.
Thank you. Ms. Burnett, any last?
I mean, I raised several, but I would say that I think keeping the strength of the State Department and the focus on having filled positions in the State Department for key roles on Africa is something very much, that remains of serious concern, because without key people in those posts, engagement, weighing of issues, access to information, all of those things are affected. So I would argue that in the very short term, that's an immediate thing that can be acted upon beyond the greater focus of, keeping Eritrea and the migration problems on the table.
Thank you. Again, thank you both. Thank you to all of our witnesses. With that, the Town Lantos Human Rights Commission is adjourned. Thank you.